Hey, how's it going, everybody? I'm going to be reacting to Pirate Software, whatever you want to call him, his video on Stop Killing Games. Um, Now, he's been in the game industry for 20 years. He used to work at Blizzard. He was QA, and then security and everything like that. I too was also in the game industry, specifically on live service games, working on MMOs. So I might have a different perspective on this. I'm also a big proponent of games preservation, but I have not watched this video, and this is the first video I'm going to be putting out. So not a very good start from my perspective. I don't have any sort of poll. I doubt anybody will ever see this, but I just wanted to get my thoughts out and talk about it a little bit. Let's go ahead and get right into it. So again, this is Pirate Software. Stop Killing Games. We're going to go ahead and take a look at this.
Hi, my name is Jason Thor Hall, also known as PirateSoftware Online. I've been in the gaming industry for about 20 years. I used to work at Blizzard Entertainment, then Amazon Game Studios, and now I own my own studio, Pirate Software, by the same name, which is an indie studio, and I've been here for about 8 years now. I also run a massive community. We've got about 180,000 people in Discord, and most of what I do is try to teach other people how to make games, teach them that they can.
I mean, yes, he has a massive community. He's got 2 million subscribers on YouTube. He's gets over 15,000 viewers on Twitch all the time. My voice means absolutely nothing in this entire discussion.
And make games, show them the tools to do so, and try to do everything without any paywalls or bullshit in the way. It's incredibly important to me that we keep making games and that the next generation has the tools to do so that our medium doesn't die out. And it never will. And that's the whole intention of all of this. So with that in mind, that community brought me this and tried to get me to sign it. And I don't want to. Number one, I can't because I don't live in Europe.
Yeah, if you're not from the European Union, you can't sign it, and trying to falsify that is not going to go well. So this is strictly for Europeans.
But number two, I wouldn't sign it even if I could. And I'm going to kind of go through this and try to explain the reasoning as to why that would be the case.
And that's fair.
Without all
Let's
of
hear
the
it.
internet hate machine that's grown up around it.
Yeah, apparently he's gotten a lot of hate for this, and it's totally okay to have different opinions and debate this sort of stuff. So
let's go into how this works and why this is an issue to me. First things first, what is an initiative? So an initiative is actually not law. It is something that you put together so you can put it up in front of representatives and they can start the conversation.
And he's correct.
The reason why I have a problem with Stop Killing Games is specifically it starts the wrong conversation. If we're trying to kill off the practice of developers putting together a live service game, pitching it as a single player experience, and then taking away support in the future, this ain't it. And the reason why is specifically on this initiative, under its own description, it says, this initiative calls to require publishers that sell or license video games to consumers in the European Union or related features and assets sold for video games they operate to leave said video games in a functional playable state. Specifically, the initiative seeks to prevent the remote disabling of video games by the publishers before providing reasonable means to continue functioning of said video games without the involvement from the side of the public.
And that's ultimately what I agree with, to an extent, and we'll get into that.
Sure. This isn't always possible in all video games.
Okay. This isn't always possible in all video games. There are specific things that I would agree with there. I want to hear his argument real quick before I say anything.
And it doesn't call out the specific practice that this is supposedly trying to defeat. It is incredibly vague and will damage all live service games. How would you keep League of Legends in a functional playable state? You'd have to re-architect the entire game. The game is what is called client-server. So in client-server models, there's a server and there's a client, and all of the math, all of the game, everything happens on the server. The client just displays it. And the reason we want to do it that way is so that you can't teleport around and do 1 billion damage.
Okay. So let's talk about that. Sure, yes. There is client-server games where they would have to have a dedicated server type executable to then host a server somewhere, either locally or online, for someone else to run for the game to remain playable. But if the game is shutting down, no one cares about you teleporting around and doing 1 billion damage. It's If you were doing this for a type of integrity for the game to operate, then sure, you want those rules in place. But no one cares once the game is no longer, do you want to be able to play the game, or is it just gone forever? Essentially, what it comes down to is you can create a dedicated server executable, package up whatever the server stuff is. Obviously, someone needs to work on that, um, but you could do it. It could be viable. I don't anticipate that this particular objective is trying to get anything retroactively figured out or adjusted. I think this is going forward. It should be things that developers and publishers keep in mind, right?
You don't trust the client. You trust the server. The client just displays what it's told, right? So if we wanted to re-architect this, we'd have to take all of that server logic, push it back out into the client, and somehow make that playable in a multiplayer-only video game.
No, you don't. You don't have to do it that way with multiplayer shooters and multiplayer whatever. I mean, you would have dedicated servers, server tech, where you just run an executable. You can host your own servers, right? It would be the same situation. There should be an option for people to keep these games alive if they want to. I don't think that the service should be on the onus of the publisher to run servers and keep those things alive.
That doesn't make sense to me. So this isn't going to work for all games. Why is it calling out all games? And
it's calling out all games because it could potentially work for all games if this rule or law or objective is put into place, then developers would have this in mind for actually making this work. I mean, Wayfinder is a fantastic example. It was a live service MMO type game. It wasn't doing well, so the developers ripped out all of that requirement and just made it a co-op game. They did that. Even so, the game wasn't doing well. They didn't have any additional funds, and someone put into work to make that happen. Obviously, that's not going to be everybody, but it's a fantastic example of them not wanting the game to die.
it's really easy to say, like, oh, that'll get worked out down the line. But we're dealing with government here. If we're going to be putting up these types of ideas specifically in front of government, we need to be calling out the right issues, especially if you don't have precedent set. Because now you're going to be setting precedent on something that doesn't make any sense with people that may not understand the nuance of our industry, all in the name of saving games. I can't agree with that. So let's go into why this is happening, right? So why did this start in the first place? What is the specific cases they've called out that are egregious? And they have one. It's The Crew. So action on The Crew. The video game The Crew, published by Ubisoft, was recently destroyed for all players and had a player base of at least 12 million.
That's misleading. It didn't have a player base of 12 million. It sold 12 million copies. So you could say a potential player base, but it's just copies sold. Now, I actually own The Crew multiple times over, and I love the game. I didn't have to interact with anybody online. There was a ton of offline content. It was the entire contiguous, United States, so you could kind of like see a slice of life from every single state, and it was really cool. It's a bit like Forza Horizon in that regard. But yeah, there's no reason why this had to be shut down and you couldn't play it offline.
Million people. Due to the game's size and France's strong consumer protection laws, this represents one of the best opportunities to hold a publisher accountable for this action. If we're successful in charges being pressed against Ubisoft, this can have a ripple effect on the video games industry to prevent publishers from destroying more games. First,
another thing to mention is that this seems to be an Ubisoft specific problem because they're going to do the same thing for, like, do we know if is the Division going to work? What about the Division 2? What about Steep, another one of their games, right? Is Steep, that was a snowboarding game. It had a lot of online functionality and originally was going to have a Switch port, but I'm assuming because it required online connectivity for literally everything, even though there's tons of offline content, tons of bots, tons of ghosts, all of the events you could run, because that's an online requirement, they didn't do the Switch port. So we're going to run into the same issue when it comes to Steep. I'm assuming we're going to run into the same issue when it comes to the Division. And none of those games I would consider are live service. So what do I consider a live service game? Before we continue, I know we're only 4 minutes into the video. A live service game is a service that you are paying for to access that service. For example, MMOs are a fantastic example of this because generally they have a subscription price. As long as you are paying for that subscription, you are paying for access to that service. When that service is no longer available, you no longer pay for it, thus, you no longer have access to it. Now, obviously, this is remedied by a lot of community run private servers. So, a lot of the more popular MMOs do have some kind of saving grace there, but not every game can have private servers designed for it. Um, Another thing to keep in mind is free to play games. If a free to play game starts up and then shuts down, I mean, that's just their prerogative at that point. You didn't have to spend any money on it, and any money you did spend on it was of your own volition to support the game. And if they shut it down, you are not owed anything, in my opinion. That's a free to play game. It is what it is. If it's a actual live service game like an MMO where you are paying for a subscription, that's also a different thing. What about a situation like Guild Wars 2? Guild Wars 2 is a MMO without a subscription price. You paid for the box fee, you pay for all the expansions, and you still access the game as long as the servers are running. And when the servers go down, that's no longer going to be accessible. However, they've marketed it in a way to where you are not misled into thinking that it is a single player game or a game that you can play by yourself or anything like that. It is, for all intents and purposes, a live service game without a subscription fee.
First off, I don't like the idea in this that it has a player base of 12 million people. That is not how long-running games work. There is a large number of people that buy the game, and that player base slowly dwindles off until nobody is playing it anymore. If there's any costs associated with keeping the game online, which this was an online video game, then eventually it costs more to keep it online.
No, it was a game that had online components. I wouldn't call it an online game.
Than it does to keep running it, right? So the cost outweighs the amount of income for it. There are bad business practices that can occur in there. There are companies that will sell a online-only game as a single-player experience and kind of just put it into the TOS and hide it. But not all companies do that. When they do, we should be calling out that specific company, not all companies. So let's take a look at this and find out more about the crew itself. And if we pull up their Wikipedia,
I wouldn't go to Wikipedia to get the full context of this particular game, but that's totally fine.
We can see that the crew was actually created in 2014, which, much to the hatred of all of us oldies on the internet, was 10 years ago. Oh.
Yep, and the Xbox 360 is 18 years old at the time of this video, so yay.
So this was an online-only racing video game developed by Ubisoft Ivory Tower and Ubisoft Reflections and published by Ubisoft. So all Ubisoft. Right?
All Ubisoft.
With that in mind, it said it was a scaled-down recreation of the contiguous United States and included both role-playing and large-scale multiplayer elements. So it had a massive multiplayer component to it. It is an online-only.
It was a massive open-world game that had online components to it. You did not have to interact with any of those online components, and you could still fully enjoy the game.
Service-based game, and they shut it down 10 years later. On March 31st, 2024, Ubisoft shut down the game's servers, rendering the game unplayable, which is normal for live service.
That should not be normal. That's the problem. It's not normal. If, for example, all of your Assassin's Creed games, you suddenly couldn't play them because they decided to shut down some servers. That sounds ludicrous to me.
Games. The only thing that I can see in here that could be a problem is if they post it as not an online-only experience. But everything that I found online shows that the game was always marketed as online-only. If you're going to be buying an online-only game, that means it can only run when it's online.
You know what? Let me actually grab my copy of the crew and see what the box actually says. I have the box here. Online connection is required, but on the back it also says that online multiplayer requires a PlayStation Plus membership. You never had to interact with anybody to play the content in this game. You could do the entire game solo, play against Ghost, play against bots, and whatever else you wanted to think of. I don't see why you would require online multiplayer for that. I wouldn't consider that a live service game.
The only thing that I can see in here that could be a problem is if they post it as not an online-only experience. But everything that I found online shows that the game was always marketed as online only. If you're going to be buying an online only game, that means it can only run when it's online. And if the servers need to shut down in the future, far in the future, it makes sense to me for the access to that game to be cut.
Yeah, but if it's an artificial limitation made by the developers, that's where I have a problem. And for all intents and purposes, looking at this, they at one point did have an offline mode and decided to take it out.
If it's online only. If it's a single player experience that has online only functionality specifically just to shut down the game in the future, and the online only doesn't actually add any gameplay functionality, I'd agree with you. That's a shitty business practice.
Well, there you go. That's what we're dealing with here.
But that's really rare. And in the specific cases where it does happen, we should call out that, not just all games and not all live service games. Further, there's more context to this too. The Crew itself came out in 2014, but it actually had a sequel that came out in...
Okay. Yes, it's a racing game in a world, but that's about where it ends. A lot of the actual concepts, like you couldn't drive around the entire United States again. You couldn't drive around an entire other country anymore, right? The driving model was completely different. All of the cars were completely different. Everything about the progression and how you actually play the game was very different. It was a very different game. I own that as well. And I didn't play it nearly as much as I played The Crew.
In 2018. And then it had another sequel that came out in 2020.
Motorfest, yeah, never even played it. After The Crew 2, I was just not interested.
And if we go to The Crew's SteamDB, which again is not going to be all of the player base for this, it's only going to show the ones who were playing it through Steam. It was on multiple platforms. We look at the max here. It did start out with a sizable amount of community, and then it degraded. And it had a major drop-off in 2018, which is the same year that it launched a sequel. This is...
I'm not seeing why this matters. I'm not saying that Ubisoft needs to keep the servers running for 100 players, but they should just make a patch to where it's not even required to connect online.
It's normal. When a sequel comes out, a lot of the player base, if the sequel doesn't suck, will move over to it. And then the servers...
And what if they don't, though? Because, here's the problem with that, right? The reason why you want people to move over to the sequel is so that they buy another game. If they don't move over to the sequel, they don't buy another game, which is lost revenue. I mean, it's kind of simple. Shut down the original game to force people onto the new game.
It's effectively die. You can't run a live service game on this few players.
Well, then don't. But why take the game away? Why does it have to be a live service game? With all the content in the game, it doesn't need to be.
You can't. Most of the time, especially not if there's anything else that goes into it. And if we go into that anything else, and we could see that there was license problems. So on December 14th, 2023, Ubisoft delisted The Crew and its expansions from digital platforms, suspended sales of microtransactions, and announced that the game's servers would shut down on March 31st. So they gave them 3 months. Usually I would say, hey, 6 months is probably a better deal, but if they're going to do 3 months, they're going to do 3 months. The only thing that I'd be interested outside of that is if there was a contractual obligation to do more than 3 months and they didn't follow it, if it was in the terms of service or not, citing upcoming server infrastructure and licensing constraints. What were those licensing constraints? Well, it turns out that all of the cars in the game were licensed from the car companies, and a 10-year running game likely means that they had license to them for 10 years.
Okay, hold on. That's not how licensing works. If I was going to license a bunch of music and I have a physical game and I print that game and I sell it, then that license is good for that SKU of the game. If I want to re-release that game with a different SKU, be it like a deluxe edition or like a remaster or something like that, those licenses have to be renewed for that particular SKU. This is why in some of the Grand Theft Auto remasters, some of the music was different. They didn't have to do that for the older versions of the games because they were different games. But for the remasters, they had to get renew licenses and get different things like that because it was a different SKU. Licenses do come into play, but this seems a little ridiculous that a license would expire and then they have to take content out of it or shut down the entire game entirely. That seems odd to me. A great example is like Fortnite. You think that Fortnite's paying for licenses for every single thing that they have in that game? You don't think that some of those things are expired? And some licenses that are expired, they're not removing that stuff from the game. People bought that stuff. So this seems like a weird argument that licensing is the reason why this particular game got shut down entirely. That doesn't make any sense.
And that means that it would likely reopen for negotiation. Now, understand that's speculation, but I've seen this type of a deal many times in the industry while I've been working in it. So it's not unlikely. If you're going...
But what games, though? I've never... I've seen license negotiations for new games, and those licenses are for that SKU, right? But once you actually get to a point, like, let's take, for example, MMOs. Your fourth expansion pack, everything like that, you have some kind of licensed thing or whatever. You don't go and it's like, oh, you know what? The license for this expired. Now I need to go remove all the content from the base game now. That doesn't make any sense.
Going to have to renegotiate on a game that has so few players and is not turning a profit anymore. You're probably just going to forego the renegotiation.
You would only have to renegotiate if you were re-releasing the game.
And if those servers are aging, you're not going to want to recreate that infrastructure. And there are some people that'll say, well, just make it all single player. Well, I've explained that doesn't make any sense in the first.
It makes perfect sense if you actually played the game, because this game did not require online components to actually enjoy.
First place. If you're making it all single player, you'd have to carve off all of that, and it's developer time and money. When you already have sequels out and the game has basically no players left anyway, it makes more sense to just move on.
If it were the same type of game, sure. We're not even talking about, like the Division 1 to the Division 2, which is even closer. But the problem is that you're at some point, the Division 1 and 2 will shut down, and they will no longer be accessible. The Destiny 1 and 2 will shut down, and they will no longer be accessible. And most of those, you can play without ever having to interact with anyone online, if you so choose. So keeping those alive in that capacity, even if it's some kind of lesser version of no online capabilities so that you can't group with anybody, so be it. Let the people actually struggle through that if they want to. This notion of, hey, this must be online to actually play the game, I'm just not buying for some of these games. I don't buy that argument, especially for the Crew, especially for Steep, especially for the Division, right? We're going to run into this issue again.
I don't find that to be a problem from the developer perspective, and I understand that people find that to be a problem from the player perspective.
I find it to be a problem from both perspectives. Like I said, Wayfinder, obviously the developers care if they hadn't made it a co-op only experience, the game would just be lost to time. It was an MMO, online service only, and then they flipped a switch and then made it co-op. How about that?
These are two different ideologies, and that's okay to have two different ideologies. I just won't agree with it because I understand the burden that puts if we raise that problem in the way that we are right now. If you try to tell me that every studio needs to run their live service game indefinitely or not want to run one at all, then no one's going to run them. And we're going to...
Wait, hold on. I don't think anyone's saying that. This is a weird argument because you're missing a giant point there. No one is suggesting that developers or publishers need to run a live service game indefinitely. And I'm not suggesting give source code, just make it executable. Or just remove the online component altogether, like remove the need to connect to a server. And I'm sure the game will still function just fine. Depending on the game, of course. I already mentioned that, for MMOs and things like that, I don't believe that this should be a requirement. But for largely single-player games with online components, sure.
To miss out on adventures like Final Fantasy XIV, and even though I don't play anymore, League of Legends, or any other...
See, but Final Fantasy XIV is an MMO, whereas League of Legends is something that could easily be done with dedicated servers. That doesn't need to be this online-only service. That's how I see it anyway. Now, it gets a little complicated because there's like a bunch of different heroes and purchasing those and everything like that, and how does that work? But you can easily make the game playable and not require connectivity to a centralized server owned by the publisher.
Other live service game, any of them. You're talking everything, like even phone games, as funny as that is. A lot of people don't realize that phone games require online-only activity. What about things like Pokemon Go? What about stuff like Monster Hunter Now?
I don't play a lot of phone games, but not every phone game, unless it's like Genshin Impact or something like that, which again, it falls in line of this is a MMO style game. But even so, You can still play Genshin Impact without connecting to the centralized servers. You can, because a lot of people on Linux do that. So I don't know.
But any of these, we'd never get any of them. And that's why I think this needs to not be vague. It needs to be specific about the business practice it's trying to defeat, which is specifically companies that are doing this under the guise of it being a single-player game, but adding online-only functionality that is not necessary and doesn't add any gameplay elements. That's the problem.
Okay, sure. No, that's a fair point. That's a fair point.
So now we're going to go to Ross, otherwise known as Accursed Farms, the creator of this initiative, and one of the ones that's pushing it the most online. I'm going to let him say exactly why he thinks that this will go through very easily and why it is important, and then I'm going to tell you why I don't agree with it.
Comes law in the EU? Yeah, it might be. Now, it's not a guarantee, but I think if we get the signatures, this passes. Why do I say that? Well, it's a few factors. Politicians like easy wins, and this doesn't require them to do much at all. And unless it involves gambling or protecting children, politicians generally don't care about video games. So this isn't of big consequence to them or most of their constituencies.
I'm going to stop it there for a moment. The assertion that politicians just like easy wins, so this legislation will go through, or that politicians don't care about a multi-billion-dollar global industry and that it doesn't matter to their constituencies is incredibly absurd to me. I don't think this is the right direction at all for a movement like this.
Yeah, I would have to agree. These particular types of arguments are fairly weak, and it's just not really selling this for me either.
I think it's incredibly damaging, and it makes our entire industry look bad, both on
Very good points. Yes, I completely agree.
on the player side and the developer side. If we're going to be putting forward anything that may eventually turn into legislation, it should be passing because it's the right thing to do for consumers and developers, and that there's some kind of a middle ground, not just because it's an easy win and politicians don't care.
I would agree. I think maybe this is just poorly worded, but yeah, no, Thor is absolutely right. PirateSoftware is absolutely right here.
This sets us off on a completely wrong foot.
EU law is already unclear on a lot of this practice anyway.
And that's dangerous. If we're
Yes, also completely agree.
going to be setting precedent, which could change the way that law works all the way down the road, then we need to be sending the right message, which this is sending a vague message that doesn't cover the actual problem. So this is not a win to me. This is a huge risk.
And we would be making it easy for them to settle it. It falls in line with other consumer practices. You know how when you buy something, you're generally allowed to keep it?
I mean, I'm seeing Thor's point here, right? This is... I don't like the reasoning behind wanting to support this particular thing. Oh yeah, no, it's coming off as like, they're just going to do it if we get enough signatures, but that's a totally bad way of looking at it. We know that we want games preservation. We know that not all games can be preserved. And I would hope not, that the expectation is to preserve every single game. For free-to-play games and things like that, I would leave that up to the actual publishers and developers. If you put money into that, I'm sorry, but I don't think they owe you anything. However, if you are buying a single-player game that has online functionality and you are not paying a monthly fee, then that game should be preserved in some kind of way. And if there is a online component for like co-op or something like that, have that be preserved. Not retroactively, not for every single game that's ever existed before now. However, having this be in the minds of developers and publishers going forward would go a long way to making sure that these games actually stay around.
The case of live service games, in the terms of service for those, you are not buying the game. You're buying a license to the game. And that's...
No, it's not just live service games. Literally for every single game. You go read the TOS of any single player game in the last 10 years, you were not buying the game. You were buying a license to play the game. And that's just... that has never sat well with me.
That's the part that's really different here. If we don't like the idea of live service games as a whole, I get it. Don't play live service games then. Don't agree to those terms. But if we're under this weird idea that we need to get rid of all live service games or damage that practice in any way to keep in line with consumer policies, it is in line with consumer policies. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be there in the first place.
That's really bad argumentation. I wouldn't agree that if it were bad for consumers, it wouldn't exist in the first place. No, that's it exists because there's nothing to regulate that for consumers, right? Just like gambling was in everything for a while, it eventually got legislation and got taken out of all of those games. These things like gotcha games and stuff like that, where you couldn't find the percentages of what was in the box, all of that got legislation and it was then adjusted in the games. This is no different than that. This is actively harming consumers because every single game that you buy, you are not buying the game, you are buying a license to play the game. It's in the TOSs. Doesn't matter if it's live service or not, you are buying a license to play the game.
So this doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. You're not buying the game, you're buying a license to the game. In the niche cases where a studio is trying to sell a game as if you are buying it or purchasing it or using that language specifically and they give you a live service game instead, I agree that should change. That language should change. You are not.
Well, then, yeah, the language should change to make it more obvious that regardless of the type of game you're playing, every single game is now a license to play that game. It's not you own nothing. This has been known for a decade now.
Not purchasing the game, you're not buying the game, you are paying to have a license to a live service experience. I get that. Is that what this is doing though? The initiative is not trying to call that out specifically. It's trying to say that all games need to stay in a functional, playable state, which is not calling out the language that is being used to manipulate the player. Call that out specifically, not this vague bullshit.
And finally, this is a diversion from really serious topics that politicians would prefer not to deal with.
That's really gross to me as well. The idea that this is just a diversion from serious topics and they can get an easy win in and we can just push it through and there won't be a lot of pushback on it and they're not going to have to think about it too hard. That's crazy dangerous, dude. If you're going to be...
Yeah, I have to agree. This is a little bit disgusting hearing it worded like that. I don't like this this idea that we're going to shove this idea into some kind of law or regulation. And no, this needs to be thought out a little better. Thor has a point there, but I also don't agree with Thor's definitions of a live service game or the assumption that purchasing something is not already considered a license to just play the game, even if it's a single player game.
Setting precedent. If you're going to be putting forward something that you want to start a conversation to eventually become legislation, and these are the reasons for it, not only can I not agree with the initiative, but I can't agree with you. And I think that the tactics that you're using here are really disgusting. So yes, I won't agree with that, and I won't agree with Ross. There's no...
I do agree that it is coming off as very disgusting. I don't like the reasoning behind supporting this particular thing.
Way around that. I think this is gross. To sum it all up, no, I will not be supporting the initiative Stop Killing Games. You're not going to change my mind on it because I find this language to be incredibly vague and damaging to the rest of our industry. I think that it will be bad for both developers and players down the line in the way that it is currently written. And I think that starting a conversation that doesn't get to the core of the issue is both wasted time and leads to potentially bad outcomes. So if we want to talk about this, let's talk about the actual bad business practices. In the case that a studio is making a live service game and they sell it to you as a product, they say that you are purchasing the game or you are buying the game, when in reality you're actually purchasing or buying a license to that game. I think that we should be fighting about that.
And again, that comes back to the issue of the games for the last 10 years have never been a product. They've always been a license. And a lot of people have had issue with that.
Needs to go away. A player should be well informed at the point of purchase that they are purchasing a license, not buying.
Oh God, I hate that he keeps saying this because yes, every single game, whether it's online or not, has been a license, and I hate it.
A game. And the reason that we have those licenses in the case of client-server interactions, like we had before, we're talking about client-server games, is so that they can ban you when you cheat at them. They revoke your license.
Sure, yes, they can revoke your license and everything like that if they really wanted to. However, they can do that with single-player games too. Every single game is now a license, regardless if it's online or not. Every single experience that you do that is live service, you will completely lose access to. If they, in Thor's definition, if they have a single player game and they say there's online components for this and it's now a live service game, they will shut it down anytime they want to and then make a remaster or make a new release of it. and stop supporting it so that you no longer have access to it and you have to buy something new to then play the same thing that you always had been because you own nothing and it's just a license.
That's why they revoke your license, to protect the gameplay of every other player that you're impacting when you cheat at these games.
If they shut down the game, then that's no longer relevant. Doesn't matter. You won't be playing the game. It's done. It's down. Who cares, right? If they make it accessible to play online in some kind of capacity, once they stop providing service, be it that someone else hosts the servers or whatever, who cares? Let someone else deal with banning cheaters or whatever.
That needs to exist, but it needs to be better informed to the player at time of purchase. So I agree on that. This doesn't bring that up, though. It just attacks all video games that have online-only components and says that they need to keep being able to be played indefinitely. That doesn't make any sense to me. Aside from that, a lot of people really like live service games as they exist now. So trying to kill off all live service games, as some people have said online, doesn't make any sense either. Live service games are a great way to get away from the real world. They're about social interaction between players. Some people get married in them. Some people met their spouse in them.
But you're conflating live service with MMOs, and MMOs, they are inherently social experiences, and generally you are paying a fee to play those experiences. Quote unquote live service games that are being touted around right now, it's a hero shooter. You choose a hero, you play a match, and then you're out of the arena. Why does that have to be a live service game? That doesn't make any sense. You're not paying to have that experience, yet when the servers go down, you will no longer be playing it at all. And it doesn't make any sense for a game like that when we've had arena shooters for decades, and they used to come with dedicated server executables that you could just host your own server if you wanted to. You used to be able to do LAN parties. Can't do any of that anymore.
And then got married in them. It's a really cool thing for a point in time in which you're having that social experience. And to destroy that just because you don't like them is very weird. I don't
understand why you keep saying to destroy these things. I don't see how anybody is saying destroy these things.
think that makes a lot of sense to me. I also don't think it makes sense the way that Ross is posing this is why it's going to pass. I think that's incredibly inflammatory and could lead to a lot of damage to both what he's trying to stop and to games as a whole. To say that the government just doesn't care and this is an easy win and we're going to get it through is disingenuous. You're talking about a multi-billion-dollar global industry. To think that the government isn't going to be meticulously looking through this and looking for flaws and holes is absurd. So
it's to get the conversation started. This isn't just a law that gets passed whenever, the initiative is signed, right? If the initiative is signed and actually gets through, it starts the conversation. It's not just passed as written. But I do agree that the wording and the reasonings for it and everything like that, they come off as very disgusting, and I don't like the wording that's being used for that at all.
I don't think that's honest at all, and I find it disgusting. So for everyone who's mad about that, fine. Be angry about it. I'm not going to change my stance on that because I can't agree with this, both as a dev and a player.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not mad at Thor for having these sort of opinions. I just think that, is he just suggesting that, games shouldn't be, preserved at all? Or is he just saying that I don't like this and that's it?
The danger involved, I see the vagueness in the language, and it doesn't make sense to me. If we want to fight for better conditions for players, then fight the actual problem. Don't make new ones.
Overall, I think that Ross's wording is very disgusting. I do agree with Thor on that particular point, but I also disagree with Thor in that live service games can have different meanings, and just because you're wanting to think that live service games you're just buying a license for, every single game that you've ever bought in the last 10 years is a license to a game. You own nothing. And I think that's really the heart of the problem. Sure, let's have those conversations and get those better worded, but actual live service games of MMOs, like World of Warcraft, although private servers exist for that, I would not expect Blizzard to maintain those servers indefinitely. I also wouldn't expect them to give the source code out. But thanks for watching. This was my first video, and not what I was hoping to actually go up against with Thor. He's got a massive audience. But I just don't agree with how he is structuring this. I also don't agree with how Ross is structuring it either. But thanks for watching, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one.